He wasn't on the mission list. A soldier, overlooked, benched, forgotten. And his partner, a K9 German Shepherd, once the pride of the unit, now limping on an old injury, considered non-operational. No orders, no backup. But when a Black Hawk went down in the mountains and command said, "It's too late," they didn't wait. They just went. One man, one dog, and what they carried back will silence every doubt you've ever had about loyalty, courage, and what it means to never leave someone behind. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. If you believe true heroes don't need orders, hit that subscribe button. Because this story, you won't forget it. The air above FOB Jericho hung hot and motionless, the kind of heat that didn't burn fast but sank into your bones and stayed. The outpost, perched on the cracked earth of southern Kandahar province, shimmered like a forgotten island, surrounded by miles of broken terrain and blistering silence. By 0700, the sun had already begun its slow siege of the desert, and the light turned everything to dust-colored flame. Nothing moved, except the faint ripples of heat that rose from the tarmac and the soft, rhythmic sweep of boots across concrete. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker stood in the shadow of a rusted communications mast, the brim of his cap low over his eyes. At 38, Ethan had the lean, dry look of a man who'd seen just enough of war to stop talking about it. His face was all sharp lines and hard shadows, framed by a sun-darkened jaw and a week-old stubble. A faint scar ran down the side of his neck, almost elegant in the way it curved toward his collarbone. His eyes, steel gray and permanently narrowed, watched the world with practiced stillness, the kind of stillness that comes from too many firefights, too many close calls, and one mission that had cost him everything but his pulse. 6 months ago, Ethan had been point man for Echo Team during a convoy rescue operation gone sideways. An IED had taken out the lead Humvee, flipping it onto his squad like a flipped coin of fate. Ethan had pulled 2 men from the fire, dislocated his shoulder doing it, and taken shrapnel through the thigh. The medal came later. The reassignment came faster. Logistics detail. No questions. No refusal. His body healed. His trust didn't. Now he handled supplies, manifests, and the occasional vehicle check, and he did it without complaint. But that didn't mean he stopped seeing, or thinking, or caring. At his side, Max shifted, sensing his attention shift. The 5-year-old German Shepherd was stocky, all muscle and quiet judgment, his black and tan coat dulled by dust and sun. His ears stood high, alert, while his deep amber eyes flicked toward the sound of static from the loudspeakers mounted to the side of the operations tent. Ethan didn't move, but he listened. "All units, this is command," came the clipped, no-nonsense voice of Colonel Franklin Briggs, commander of Jericho. "Black Hawk 3 has gone dark. Last contact at 0531 hours. Grid location 4 Charlie. Possible terrain interference. Preliminary satellite recon suggests high structural damage. No active beacon. No thermal signatures. Recovery deemed non-viable. Stand down." Max tilted his head as if listening too. Ethan exhaled slowly. 4 Charlie. That was bad country. Sharp rock shelves, high winds, no landing zones. He'd been through there once, years ago on a recon pass. It wasn't impossible to reach, but it was damn close. Still, it wasn't his place to ask questions anymore. Just push crates and check rosters. A few soldiers nearby muttered softly. No one said much. No one ever did when something went missing in a place like this. Ethan turned away and walked back toward the edge of the maintenance lot. The base buzzed with low-level noise, helicopter rotors idling, radios clicking, mechanics shouting from under the bellies of MRAPs. Life went on, even when someone didn't come back. Colonel Briggs wasn't a bad officer on paper. At 53, he had the stiff-backed bearing of an old-school tactician, tall, white, always clean-shaven, with a jawline like a granite edge, and sharp blue eyes that rarely blinked. His uniform was always perfect, his boots spotless. But those who worked near him knew he was a man who didn't forget slights. Quietly territorial, calculating. No mistakes, but no compassion either. He spoke in briefings like he was still auditioning for promotion, and he had history with Captain Noah Reed, the pilot of Black Hawk 3. Noah was the kind of officer men followed for his calm, not his rank. At 40, Reed was known for flying low, speaking plainly and caring too much. He had a way of remembering names, a face like someone who'd once laughed a lot, and maybe still would if things ever quieted down. Rumor had it, a year ago, Reed had gone around Briggs' authority during an emergency evac of local civilians, bypassed protocol, saved 30 people, including 2 foreign aid workers. Command had praised him. Briggs had never spoken of it again. Until now. Ethan sat on the edge of a loading crate outside his barracks, Max at his feet. He watched the command tent from a distance as officers moved in and out. There was no scramble, no rush, no rescue team assembling. He'd seen it before, how war wore down urgency. But this felt different. Too fast. Too final. He ran a hand through his short hair, brow furrowed. He reached under his cot and pulled out an old field folder, the kind issued years ago when maps were still printed and laminated. Inside was a hand-drawn topographical sketch. Grid 4 Charlie, elevation points, fault lines, and a narrow cut along the southern ridge. He'd mapped it during that old recon. A goat trail, half eroded but passable by foot. No drone would spot it. No satellite would care. But he remembered. So did Max. The dog stood suddenly, moving to the door, tail low but stiff. Ethan looked down at the map. He tapped one edge with his finger. "That's where they are," he said under his breath. The words didn't surprise him. Not anymore. He hadn't trusted orders in years. Not when they came from men like Briggs, who saw decisions as ladders and people as steps. He folded the map carefully, slid it into a waterproof pouch, and tucked it into the bottom of his ruck. His movements were slow, methodical. Not yet a mission. Not yet a rebellion. Just preparation. Max watched him without blinking. Ethan leaned back against the wall, exhaled once, and whispered, "Something's wrong." And somewhere in the burning silence of the desert, the wreck of Black Hawk 3 still smoldered unseen. The sun had risen to its cruelest point by late morning, baking every inch of FOB Jericho until the sandbags steamed and the metal rails sizzled to the touch. Inside his quarters, Ethan Walker worked with the quiet precision of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone except himself. The hand-drawn map lay flat across the cot, edges held down by a flashlight, a canteen, and an old combat knife. Red ink still clear, lines marking elevation shifts, and the barely visible cut in Grid 4 Charlie that no satellite feed would ever notice. Max lay in the corner, eyes following Ethan's every move. The German Shepherd's breathing was slow, controlled. The room was too warm for comfort, but Max never panted unnecessarily. His focus never wavered. Ethan packed slowly. Not too little, not too much. 2 MREs, 1 collapsible water bladder, IFAC medical kit, sling harness with reinforced straps, spare radio battery, a signal flare, his sidearm stripped of serial tags, no comms tracker, nothing the base could use to trace him. He wasn't deserting, not exactly, but he also wasn't about to ask permission to do what no one else had the guts to try. Outside, the base carried on its routines. Engines hummed, radios buzzed. Somewhere a group of soldiers laughed, an unusual, almost brittle sound in this dust-blown place. Ethan zipped his ruck halfway, paused, then reached for a cloth-wrapped item beneath his cot. Inside was a journal, not regulation issue, hand-bound, pages worn soft. It had once belonged to Sergeant Will Hernandez, a combat medic Ethan had served with 2 years ago. Will had been the kind who whistled during artillery strikes, who gave nicknames to every stray dog, and who'd once bandaged a child's leg using duct tape and prayer. He'd died in a collapsed alley in Ghazni. Ethan had found the journal in Will's pack afterward. He never read it, just carried it. Today he tucked it in the ruck's side pouch. "Let's go, Max," Ethan said. The dog stood immediately, his tail low but steady, his vest snug across his broad chest. Together, they stepped outside into the blinding white heat. Ethan moved with purpose through the maze of HESCO barriers and parked supply trucks, nodding briefly to anyone who met his eyes. It was easy to blend in when you looked like you belonged. Most soldiers were too tired, too hot, or too distracted to question a supply sergeant hauling gear. He passed Sergeant Dana Liu near the motor pool, a tall, sinewy mechanic with tattooed arms and grease-streaked coveralls. Dana was 32, Chinese-American, with high cheekbones and an always suspicious look. She could rebuild a Humvee transmission in 90 minutes and took pride in cursing fluently in 3 languages. She noticed Ethan's pack, but said nothing, only flicked her chin toward the fuel tanks. "Stay cool, Walker," she muttered. "You too," he replied, not slowing. By the time he reached the southern perimeter gate, more symbolic than functional, Ethan's pulse had steadied. The guard station was manned by Private Marcus Galloway, a 19-year-old from Ohio who wore his helmet 2 sizes too big and still believed in the rules. Ethan knelt beside Max, adjusting the straps on his vest, using the motion to subtly unclip the comms repeater bolted near the post. The device would broadcast a local echo of Max's location tag for at least 30 minutes before failing. "Galloway," Ethan said, standing. "Captain has me running a recon check on fuel lines near the Old West Trench. No drone coverage, manual inspection. We'll be back by sundown." The kid blinked, adjusted his helmet, nodded. "Yes, sir. Should I log you out?" "No need," Ethan said calmly. "Just routine. Max needed a walk anyway." With that, he and Max slipped through the gate. No alarm, no questions. The desert swallowed them in minutes. Southwest of Jericho, the land fell away into a tangle of rocky shelves and dry gullies. The trail Ethan remembered was barely more than a suggestion, half buried under years of erosion and wind-blown sand. But Max followed it like a memory, nose low, tail tight. An hour in, they stopped beneath a rock overhang to hydrate. The sun had begun its slow shift westward, and shadows pooled in cracks along the ground. Ethan took a moment to check the satellite tracker clipped to his belt. Not active, but wired to signal emergency frequencies if he toggled it manually. He didn't plan to. "I don't trust Briggs," Ethan said aloud, mostly to himself. "That man wouldn't send water to a burning village unless it served his career." Max thumped his tail once against the dirt. Back at Jericho, Briggs stood inside the cool gloom of the command tent, hands behind his back, gaze locked on the flickering screen showing static drone images from Grid 4 Charlie. Beside him stood Lieutenant Adam Trask, a clean-cut junior officer barely 30, with a face too honest for politics and a voice that still cracked when he got nervous. "Sir," Trask said, clearing his throat, "we just received a ping off the emergency beacon. It's faint, intermittent, could be wind distortion, but—" "Or a false positive," Briggs interrupted sharply. He was still in full dress uniform despite the heat, creases sharp, brass gleaming. His square face and silver hair gave him a deceptive air of wisdom, but his eyes were cold. "I'm not risking 6 lives to chase echoes." Trask hesitated. "But sir, Captain Reed's daughters, his family's been calling—" "This is not a charity operation, Lieutenant," Briggs snapped. "We go where the data tells us to, and the data says there's nothing left to find." Trask looked down, jaw tight. He didn't speak again. Back in the desert, Ethan climbed a jagged slope, each footstep deliberate. The weight of the pack pressed into his shoulders, sweat soaked his shirt, and still he moved forward. They reached the crest of the ridge just as the sun began to fade into a blistered red. Ethan scanned the valley below. No wreckage yet, but something told him they were close. Max sat beside him, ears perked, nose twitching toward the wind. Ethan crouched and unfolded the map. Just a little farther. He didn't know if Reed was still alive, but he knew this. The man didn't deserve to be left for dead because someone in a clean uniform had an old grudge. Night in the Afghan mountains wasn't made of silence. It was a heavy kind of stillness, full of unsaid warnings and unseen things. The wind whispered down from jagged peaks, scraping across gravel like breath across broken glass. Ethan Walker moved slowly, deliberately, one hand gripping a steel ridge for balance while the other adjusted the sling of his rifle. His boots crunched against loose rock, each step echoing faintly in the tight canyon walls. Beside him, Max trotted low and steady, nose close to the ground, his tawny coat blending almost perfectly with the dust-covered terrain. The German Shepherd was 6 years old, seasoned, disciplined, and sharp. A former K9 search dog repurposed for patrol work after shrapnel tore up his rear leg in Kandahar. It had left a faint limp, but not in spirit. Max's eyes remained clear, focused, and always one step ahead of Ethan, like a scout that never questioned the mission. Ethan wore a desert-battered tan t-shirt, sleeves rolled up, his forearms streaked with dirt and dried sweat. The pack on his back carried just the essentials: water, rations, medkit, and a weathered map folded so many times its creases had started to tear. A pistol hugged his hip, and the blade strapped to his boot wasn't for show. The rifle slung across his shoulder was loaded, but he hoped he wouldn't need it. They had been hiking for nearly 2 hours since leaving the outer perimeter of Camp Jericho, a forward base carved into the cliffside 2 miles north of where the Blackhawks' last signal had pinged. The sun had fallen behind the western ridgeline, and shadows now dominated the ravine. Ethan squinted at his GPS tracker. Still no signal. Still no confirmation. But something else nagged at him: the quiet. Even in remote terrain like this, there were usually signs of life. Chirps, rustling insects, maybe even distant hooves from mountain goats or wild dogs. But tonight, nothing. It felt emptied. Ethan didn't talk. He hadn't for the last hour. Max, trained for silence, only glanced back occasionally, his ears alert, never relaxed. This wasn't just reconnaissance anymore. It was something else. At a bend in the canyon, Ethan slowed. A glint of something metallic caught the corner of his eye beneath a pile of shale and dry scrub. He crouched, brushed it clean with his gloved fingers, and uncovered a shattered casing from a comms unit, scorched with its antenna severed clean through. Ethan tilted it toward the faint light. The markings were still visible. U.S. Army, serial BH-03RX. Blackhawk 3, Ethan muttered under his breath. Damn it! He ran his fingers along the break. This wasn't crushed in the crash. It had been sliced with a sharp edge, sabotaged. Max growled softly. Ethan's head snapped up. What is it, boy? The shepherd had frozen, tail rigid, ears pointing forward like twin arrows. He sniffed twice, then veered toward the canyon's edge, where the wall broke into a slope of jagged stone leading down to a narrow gulch. The slope was steep, mostly loose gravel and scrub, but Max moved with certainty. Ethan followed. The descent was slow, rough. Gravel slid beneath his boots, and once he nearly lost footing on a slanted slab of rock, only catching himself on a protruding root. Max waited below, his silhouette half swallowed by the dark. Ethan dropped beside him and crouched low. What do you have? Max lowered his nose, sniffed again, then gave a low, short bark. Not an alert, but a signal. Ethan squinted at the ground, and then he saw it. A single smear of something dark, half-dried. He reached into his pack for the flashlight and clicked it on. Blood. Not fresh. Not old either. Maybe a day, 2 at most. It trailed toward a narrow path chiseled into the cliffside like a wound. Ethan's chest tightened. Captain Reed. He didn't say it out loud, but the question settled like dust in his throat. Max took the lead, following the scent. Each step was careful, deliberate. The blood trail was faint, vanishing and reappearing along the rocky path. Once, Ethan found a torn thread from a flight suit caught on a broken thorn. No signs of a body being dragged, no footprints. The man had moved on his own, if barely. The canyon deepened. They moved for another 10 minutes in silence until the trail led to a split in the rock, a natural crevice barely wider than Max's shoulders. The shepherd paused, sniffed, then looked back. Ethan knelt, scanned the rocks, then turned off his light. He listened. Wind. His own breath. Nothing else. But his gut twisted. They were close. He could feel it. Max stepped forward, tail still, nose down, then barked once, sharper this time. Ethan moved beside him, lowered to his knees, and angled his light into the crack in the stone. The beam disappeared into shadow, and something, a glint maybe, or just instinct, tightened around Ethan's ribs. We're not alone down here, he whispered. The path narrowed into a scar carved by time and wind, barely wide enough for Ethan's shoulders to pass through. His breath scraped in his throat as he ducked under jagged rock formations, fingers brushing against the sandstone walls for balance. Behind him, Max pressed close, his dark eyes scanning every shadow, every crevice. The blood trail had faded, but the instinct hadn't. Max's nose stayed low to the ground, pausing now and then to sniff at a scrap of fabric, a smudge on a rock, a bent weed where something, or someone, had fallen. The farther they moved into the gorge, the more the world around them seemed to vanish. No more wind, no more birds. Just the crunch of Ethan's boots and the soft scrape of Max's paws. It was deathly quiet. The map in Ethan's pocket, His own, not the sanctioned military ones, showed no detail of this narrow cleft. It was a feature he remembered only vaguely from aerial surveys, an anomaly too shallow to note. But now it was real, tangible, and, it seemed, deliberately hidden. About 100 meters down, Max paused beside a cluster of rocks, his body tensed, nose twitching hard. Ethan stopped too, crouching next to him. That's when he saw it, a dark green patch of cloth, half buried beneath dust and gravel. He pulled it free gently, flight fabric, torn, singed at the edges. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Captain Reed," he murmured, his voice low. "You're close." He tucked the cloth into his vest and looked around. The canyon here widened slightly into a basin-like hollow, ringed by steep walls that cast long, unforgiving shadows. At the far end, hidden behind a curtain of thorny brush and jagged debris, something gleamed faintly beneath a layer of soot and dirt. Ethan pushed through the brush, ignoring the thorns that bit into his forearms, and there it was, the remains of the Black Hawk, or what was left of it. The fuselage lay twisted and charred, one rotor blade jutting upward like the broken hand of a fallen giant. The cockpit was smashed inward, the windshield glass shattered into a spiderweb pattern. Blackened scorch marks streaked across the rock face behind it. The fire hadn't been long ago. He could still smell the chemical tang of burned wires and scorched metal. Max stopped beside him, silent, ears pinned back. Ethan moved slowly, cautiously circling the wreck. He noted the impact angles, downward, steep, as if the pilot had tried to nosedive into the ravine to avoid hitting the ridgeline. Judging by the wreckage, it had worked, barely. He crouched beside the right side of the aircraft, where the body of the Black Hawk had buckled in on itself. There were no bodies outside, no blood trails leading away, no signs of extraction. Whoever had been aboard had either burned inside or crawled out and disappeared. Ethan moved to the cargo door, twisted, but still partially attached. He braced himself and pulled. The metal groaned, resisting, then popped loose with a sharp creak. Dust billowed into the air. He ducked inside, flashlight sweeping the dark interior. Empty. Scorch marks along the floor. Burned-out containers. No gear, no bags. Just the hollow carcass of a mission that had gone wrong. Then his light caught something. A boot print in the ash. Deep. Fresh. Someone had walked through here not long ago. Max growled again, but didn't bark. He was watching the front of the aircraft now, nose angled toward the crumpled cockpit. Ethan nodded. "Let's check it out." He climbed forward, careful not to shift the unstable flooring. The nose of the aircraft had folded in during the crash, the front glass blown out. Wires dangled like vines. The pilot's seat was tilted sideways, part of it buried under a collapsed console. Ethan reached up, cleared the debris with one hand, and then he saw him. Captain Noah Reed. His body was slumped against the ruined instrument panel, face pale, smeared with ash and blood. One arm hung limp over the side of the seat, the other tucked against his chest. His flight suit was scorched at the collar, a long tear across the thigh. His face, square-jawed with a fading beard, was marred by a deep gash over his left brow. His eyes were closed. But his chest rose. Barely. Ethan's heart jumped. "You're alive!" He reached for the man's wrist, feeling for a pulse. Faint. But there. He pressed his palm against Reed's sternum, checking breathing, ragged, shallow, but steady. "Hold on," Ethan whispered. "I've got you." Reed didn't stir. Ethan quickly assessed visible injuries. Head trauma, possible rib fractures, dehydration. But he'd lasted this long alone, with no med support and no supplies. That meant something. He gently searched the pilot's vest for ID and tags. In the chest pocket, tucked inside a zipped pouch, he felt something stiff. A plastic-sealed document. Ethan pulled it free and angled his flashlight. Top line, eyes only, operational deviation authorization. His breath caught. It was signed by Colonel Briggs. The new coordinates, the reroute orders, all handwritten. He didn't have time to read it all, but he didn't need to. It was enough to know Reed hadn't ended up here by accident, and Briggs had wanted no one to find him. Outside, Max barked suddenly, just once, sharp. Ethan froze. Then, slowly, slid the document into his own vest, zipped it shut, and placed a hand on Reed's shoulder. "You're safe now," he said, voice low. "We'll get you out." But deep down he knew the way out was going to be harder than the way in. The first step out of the ravine felt heavier than anything Ethan Walker had ever carried. Captain Noah Reed, unconscious, his weight slung across Ethan's back with the aid of a makeshift rescue harness, was dead weight, cold and still like the shadows they were leaving behind. Max padded ahead silently, tail down, alert, but not afraid. The shepherd's paws sank slightly into the coarse gravel as he turned his head to glance at Ethan, as if checking. "You good?" "No, not good, but moving." The incline was cruel. Every loose rock beneath Ethan's boots threatened to undo the fragile balance he fought to maintain. His shirt clung to him, soaked with sweat and streaked with blood from the scrape across his ribs. He hadn't even noticed it until it stung in the dry wind. The sun had returned now, climbing past the rim of the canyon like a fireball glaring at his defiance. Heat rippled off the stones. The path upward had no shade, no mercy. Max led them up the slope, veering right toward a natural cut through the rock. The dog's body was lean, muscular under his sandy coat, a pale streak of fur running along his right haunch, the scar from shrapnel. 6 years old and still more focused than any soldier Ethan had known. The shepherd moved with precision, pausing now and then to look back, ears high. Ethan grunted with effort as he adjusted Reed's weight. The captain's body shifted slightly, and a low groan slipped from his lips, almost inaudible. Still alive. That was enough. "You better not die on me now," Ethan muttered through clenched teeth. "You owe me a beer for this." The canyon behind them looked like a mouth closing. Dark, deep, and silent. The further they climbed, the more the sounds of nature returned. The rustle of wind through dry grass, the chirp of some insect brave enough to survive this hell. Ethan's boots dug into the slope, and every foot gained felt like a small rebellion against gravity. Then it hit. The memory. He was in another desert, years ago, Fallujah. A firefight at dawn, screams, smoke. The body of his best friend, Drew Mason, bleeding out in his arms. Ethan had tried to carry him too. Same grip, same dragging weight. But Mason never made it out. A knot formed in his throat. His hands trembled. He stopped walking. Max turned and stood there, waiting. Ethan looked up, gasping for breath. The world spun for a second. He dropped to one knee, easing Reed down onto the rocks with a gentleness that betrayed his exhaustion. "I couldn't save Drew," he whispered, voice hoarse. "Don't make me fail again." Max padded closer. He didn't bark, didn't nudge. He simply sat beside Ethan, eyes steady, waiting, watching. It was enough. After a few moments, Ethan exhaled hard, stood again, and hoisted Reed back over his shoulders. This wasn't Fallujah, and Reed wasn't dead. Not yet. They kept moving, higher now. The slope became narrower. Sharp rocks clawed at their boots, and twice Ethan had to brace himself with his shoulder against the canyon wall, just to rest for 10 seconds. Each pause cost them, but so did stopping altogether. Eventually they reached a plateau, a dry, flat ledge with a decent view of the eastern valley. Ethan lowered Reed gently onto the dirt, checked his pulse, still faint but present, and gave him another sip of water from the shared canteen. Then he sat back, chest heaving, sweat streaking down his temple. His hands were shaking. He could feel the soreness down to his bones. The wind picked up slightly. Max, sitting just ahead on the ridge's edge, suddenly perked up. His ears snapped to attention, and he stood, tail wagging slightly, not with joy, but alertness. Ethan followed his gaze. Far across the valley, framed by heat haze and clouds of dust, a dark speck moved across the sky. A chopper. Ethan grabbed the small emergency flare from his pack and snapped it. Bright orange smoke burst into the air, curling and fighting the wind. "Come on," he muttered. "See us." The chopper dipped slightly, circled wide, but didn't approach. It wasn't clear if they'd seen the flare or if they were just scouting the wreck site. Max barked sharply, twice, then looked back at Ethan, ears forward, tail twitching. Ethan's jaw tightened. They were close, but not safe. Not yet. The chop of rotor blades cut through the desert air like the sharp edge of a knife. Dust swirled across the ridge, sand biting into Ethan's skin as the helicopter circled overhead. Max barked once, sharp and alert, his body low to the ground as the wind picked up around them. Ethan raised both arms, waving the last red flare above his head. His voice was gone from hours of heat and strain, but he shouted anyway. "We're here!" The chopper banked hard, then slowed into a hover. Seconds later, it descended in a cloud of grit, the landing skids touching down 20 feet away on a flat slab of sun-baked rock. The side doors flew open, and 3 soldiers in desert fatigues jumped out, weapons slung but eyes scanning. Leading them was Staff Sergeant Miguel Torres, a lean, wiry man in his late 30s, with a square jaw, sharp eyes, and a deep scar that ran from his left temple to the edge of his jawline. His skin was tanned, almost leathered from sun exposure, and his voice barked commands in clipped Spanish-accented English. "Secure the perimeter. Check the ridge. We've got 2 live bodies." He reached Ethan in 5 long strides and dropped to one knee beside Reed, who lay unconscious, lips cracked, face ghostly pale. "Captain Reed?" Torres asked, eyes narrowing. Ethan nodded, lowering himself to his knees. "Still breathing, barely. He's priority." Torres turned to his medic. "Get him on the bird now!" 2 medics moved with efficiency, slipping a stretcher beneath Reed's frame. Ethan stepped aside but didn't rest. He turned to Max, who was now standing beside him, panting but steady. Torres turned to Ethan. "You're Walker, right? Jericho base?" Ethan gave a curt nod. "Acting alone. No authorization. I'll take the reprimand later." Torres grunted. "We'll see, but you damn well saved a man." Ethan didn't respond. He watched as Reed was lifted into the helicopter. His chest rose and fell slowly, a medic already placing oxygen over his face. Max jumped into the bird next without hesitation, curling at Reed's feet. As Ethan moved to follow, a hand grabbed his arm. "You're injured too," Torres said. "I'll live." Torres studied him for a moment, then helped him inside. The rotors were already spinning harder, kicking up a storm of debris. Inside the chopper, the space was tight, the smell of antiseptic already replacing the scent of sweat and blood. Ethan settled beside Reed, his fingers resting over the sealed pouch still in the captain's vest. He leaned toward the lead medic, a young corporal with freckles and sandy blonde hair barely visible beneath his helmet. "I need you to listen carefully," Ethan said, voice firm. "Inside his vest, left chest pocket, there's a sealed document. It needs to go directly to command. No one else touches it. Understood?" The medic blinked, unsure. Torres leaned in from the doorway, having overheard. "Why?" "Because it's signed by Colonel Briggs," Ethan replied, his voice like gravel. "And it explains why Captain Reed ended up in that canyon. That chopper didn't crash because of weather." Silence fell in the cabin for a moment. The medic turned to Torres. The staff sergeant stared at Ethan, lips tight. "You sure about what you're saying?" "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." Torres gave a slow nod. "All right, I'll make sure it goes where it needs to go." As the doors slammed shut and the helicopter lifted, Ethan let his head fall back against the metal. The sound of engines roared in his ears, but inside, all he could hear was his own pulse, the ache in his arms, the burn behind his eyes, Max's steady breathing near his boots. He didn't feel relief. Not yet. Because this wasn't the end. Not with Briggs still in uniform, and not with men like Captain Reed still barely hanging on. The military courtroom was not a grand hall like in the movies. It was small, beige, and oppressively still. The walls were covered in soundproof padding, and the ceiling hummed with the quiet buzz of fluorescent lights. No flags, no drama, just truth waiting to be unearthed. Ethan Walker sat rigid on the left side of the room, his uniform freshly laundered, but still carrying the creases of fatigue. His knuckles were pale where he clenched his hands. Beside him, Max sat alert, eyes scanning the room. The German Shepherd had been bathed and bandaged, but the pink line along his haunch where fur had been burned was still visible. Captain Noah Reed, still pale but now conscious, sat in a wheelchair near the back. His left leg was braced, and stitches lined his forehead. A pair of crutches leaned against the wall behind him. The weight loss and pain had aged him in just days, but his sharp blue eyes had returned, clear and unwavering. And at the center of it all, Colonel Richard Briggs. He stood behind the defense table, tall, broad-shouldered, with silvered temples and a clean-shaven jaw that always seemed clenched. His uniform bore no wrinkle, no dust. His medals gleamed, but there was something hollow in his stare, calculated like a man used to spinning stories until they became someone else's truth. The proceedings were being overseen by Major Cynthia Hale, a black woman in her early 50s with steel gray eyes and a voice that demanded respect. Her hair was tightly braided, her posture like carved stone. "We're here to examine allegations of dereliction of duty, falsification of mission reports, and obstruction of a military rescue operation," she began, voice cutting through the silence. "Colonel Briggs, do you understand the charges against you?" "I do," Briggs replied, tone clipped, "and I contest them all." Ethan's jaw tightened. One by one, witnesses took the stand. First was Staff Sergeant Torres, who had led the extraction team. He detailed how they received unauthorized coordinates from Ethan and how they found both the downed pilot and sealed orders with Colonel Briggs's signature, orders that rerouted Captain Reed into a known restricted zone with no backup plan. Then came the drone specialist, a thin, nervous man named Private Glenn, who wore glasses too large for his face. He provided thermal and video data showing the downed Black Hawk and the blocked communication node nearby, sabotaged, not damaged by crash. The data also showed delayed transmission logs and doctored GPS points originating from Jericho Base. Finally, Major Hale called Ethan to the stand. He stood tall despite the ache in his body, the bruises across his ribs, the exhaustion clinging to his bones like sand. Max lay down beside the witness box, eyes never leaving Briggs. "Corporal Walker," Hale began, "your hand-drawn map has been presented as key evidence. Can you confirm its origin and accuracy?" "Yes, ma'am. I created it myself during a recon op 2 years ago. That path wasn't marked on official records." "And did you believe it was still viable?" "I bet my life on it," Ethan said, "and Captain Reed's." There was a murmur across the room. Briggs leaned slightly forward, lips thin. "Tell us," Hale said, voice calm, "why you chose to go against orders." "Because they weren't orders," Ethan replied. "They were silence." Briggs shut the operation down when he realized who was on that chopper. He tried to make it disappear. Hale raised an eyebrow. "And why would he do that?" "Because of this," Ethan said, pulling the sealed document bag from a secure envelope. He passed it to the bailiff, who brought it forward. Inside was the authorization paper, signed and dated by Colonel Briggs, handwritten, unauthorized, routing Captain Reed directly into the ravine under the pretense of intel gathering. No backup team, no radio log, no exit plan. "And what is this signature?" "Briggs's. I've seen it 100 times. Silence followed as the panel reviewed the document. Colonel Briggs finally stood. "That document," he said coldly, "is a fabrication." Major Hale turned toward him. "Are you accusing your own base's clerical records of forgery?" Briggs paused, just long enough to tell the room he was calculating. "It's possible the document was altered after the crash, but the ink matches your pen registry," Torres said from the gallery, "and the GPS coordinates match the route Captain Reed flew. You rerouted him off the grid." Briggs opened his mouth, but Reed wheeled himself forward, his voice strained but firm. "You sent me out there to die," he said, "because of what happened in Kandahar, because I testified against you during the supply embezzlement inquiry." Every eye in the room snapped toward Briggs. Now the mask cracked. His lips twitched. "That was years ago." "And you never forgot," Reed said. Major Hale raised her hand. "That's enough. Colonel Briggs, based on the testimony and evidence presented today, including falsified orders, sabotage of comms, and targeted assignment of Captain Reed without authorization, you are hereby recommended for court-martial under Article 92 and Article 133. The gavel hit once. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Colonel Briggs stood motionless for a long beat. Then, slowly, he was led out by military police, flanked on both sides. As the door shut behind him, Ethan finally exhaled. Beside him, Max leaned into his leg, warm and steady. Justice had only just begun. 3 weeks later, the desert felt quieter. The heat still shimmered off the pavement. The wind still kicked up red dust in angry little swirls, but the tension that had haunted Jericho Base was gone. Colonel Briggs had been stripped of his rank and removed under armed escort. Whispers of the court-martial echoed through every tent and hall like a storm that had passed but left its mark. Ethan Walker sat outside the K9 training shed, sleeves rolled up, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. His forearms bore fresh scars. His face was a little thinner now, more tired, but also somehow lighter. The bruises were fading. The nightmares hadn't. Max lay beside him in the shade of the metal overhang, head on his paws. His ear twitched at the distant sound of boots crunching gravel, but otherwise stayed still, relaxed, but aware. He had a new collar now, thicker, reinforced, but Ethan had refused the metal they tried to pin to it. Dogs don't need medals, he'd told the base commander. They just need someone to trust them. Across the compound, tents flapped softly in the hot breeze. Soldiers moved about, some stopping briefly to nod at Ethan. The respect wasn't loud. It didn't come with speeches or brass bands, but it was there. Private Jenna Hayes, mid-20s, dark curls pinned under her patrol cap, wide eyes full of curiosity, approached, clipboard in hand. "They're holding a ceremony tonight," she said, eyes flicking toward Max. "They still want you both on stage." Ethan shook his head slowly. "We're not going." Hayes hesitated, then smiled. "Didn't think so." She left without pressing, but she did scratch Max behind the ears before walking off. The shepherd didn't move, only blinked slowly in approval. Later that afternoon, Ethan was in the motor pool checking the tires on a convoy jeep when he heard the unmistakable clack of crutches on concrete. Captain Noah Reed had a presence even now, pale, thinner, but upright. His flight suit was half-zipped, an orthopedic brace still hugging his left leg. His beard had grown in slightly, giving him a more rugged look than the clean-cut officer who had vanished weeks ago. Ethan turned as Reed approached, nodding once. "You're walking." "Somewhat," Reed smirked. "Thanks to you." Max trotted forward and nudged Reed's hand gently. The captain knelt slowly and scratched behind his ears. "And especially thanks to you, partner." They stood in silence for a beat. "I read the full report," Reed said at last. "They would have buried it. Hell, they buried a lot before you dug it back up." Ethan looked out across the desert. "You don't have to thank me." "I'm not here to thank you," Reed said. "I'm here to tell you, you changed things. People here, soldiers, they're watching differently now, asking better questions." Ethan finally looked back at him. "Took long enough?" Reed chuckled. "They wanted to give you a medal too, maybe even reassign you to a combat post again." I said no. "Why?" Ethan paused, then shrugged. "Because when things go quiet again, when someone important is missing, they'll need someone who moves before the orders come down, not after." That night, as the sun dipped low over the rocky ridge, the base gathered in the mess hall for the official ceremony. Flags hung from the ceiling. Brass shone. Speeches were made. Briggs's name was never mentioned, but the air carried his absence like a ghost. Ethan didn't attend. Instead, he sat with Max on the edge of the compound wall, watching the stars emerge. He shared a piece of jerky with the dog, who chewed with quiet satisfaction. Behind him, footsteps approached. It was the new base commander, Colonel Sarah Thompson, tall, lean, early 50s with short gray hair and a voice like distant thunder. She'd arrived only 2 days prior, brought in to clean up the mess Briggs had left behind. Known for integrity, she was both respected and feared. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. Ethan gestured to the wall. "Plenty of desert to go around." She sat down beside him. "They told me everything. About Reed, about the orders, about Max." Ethan didn't speak. Thompson glanced at him. "You refused the medal, the reassignment, the citation." He nodded once. She studied him. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. Max leaned against his leg. Thompson turned her gaze to the horizon. After a long pause, Ethan finally spoke. While everyone else was still arguing in a room, me and Max were already moving. She said nothing, but she smiled and said no more.
"Get that damn mud out of here before I lose it," the grieving uncle barked, veins throbbing on his reddened forehead. The man had barely managed to hold himself together, and now this, a filthy, barking dog digging wildly at his niece's grave in the middle of the funeral. The shovel hadn't even hit the ground fully yet. The priest stood frozen, unsure whether to continue. Mourners gasped, some pulling children back from the open earth. The dog, a scrappy, mud-covered German shepherd mix with intelligent amber eyes, was growling now, his front paws striking the soil with frantic energy. People yelled. Someone reached for him, but he snapped, not viciously, more like warning. His body shook as he kept digging, inching his snout closer to the casket, buried just beneath the loose earth. Reverend Malcolm stepped forward, confused but oddly compelled. "Wait," he said softly, raising a hand. "Let's just wait." No one moved. The dog, ignoring the chaos, began to howl, long and mournful. It echoed through the cemetery like a siren of pain. His muzzle was dirty, his claws torn and bleeding, but he wouldn't stop. Elliot Hayes, a wildlife ranger who had once served overseas and seen more war than most, was the only one who didn't flinch when the dog lunged again at the ground. He approached slowly, crouching a few feet away. "He's not just digging," Elliot murmured. "He's trying to tell us something," a teenage girl whispered behind him. "That dog's been outside the gate since dawn, just sitting, watching." The wind picked up, scattering petals from the wreaths across the stone markers. Elliot stepped forward, this time placing a calming hand on the dog's back. Surprisingly, the dog didn't snap. He paused, panting hard, and looked up at Elliot with wild, pleading eyes. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. The family of the deceased girl, 16-year-old Grace Turner, watched in disbelief. Her mother clutched her husband's jacket. "This is cursed," she sobbed. "Her soul won't rest." "No," Elliot said firmly. "It's not that. It's something else." He pulled his phone from his jacket. "We're going to need the authorities and a forensic team, right now." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The casket had barely been lowered. Yet here was this strange dog, clawing at the earth like his heart was buried underneath. 30 minutes later, after tearful resistance and procedural chaos, they pulled the casket back up. What they found inside wasn't just shocking, it was horrifying. Grace Turner's coffin wasn't empty, but it didn't hold her alone. Wrapped tightly around her lifeless body, face down, was something no one could have expected. A second, much smaller frame, human, wrapped in fabric, hidden beneath her funeral dress. A baby, a newborn baby. The cemetery staff dropped their tools. The coroner staggered backward, hands shaking. One of the mourners fainted. The dog began to cry. Not howl, not bark, but that low, guttural whimper dogs make when their hearts are breaking. Someone whispered the words everyone else was too paralyzed to say. She gave birth, and no one knew. The baby had been gone. For hours, maybe longer. There was no heartbeat, no warmth, but questions flared like wildfires. Who was the father? Why hadn't anyone noticed? Had she been hiding it? Was it a secret pregnancy, or worse? Was it covered up? The police arrived within minutes, and with them came a detective named Laurel Drake, who had a reputation for uncovering truths no one wanted to hear. She looked at the scene, then crouched next to the dog. "Where did you come from?" she asked, not expecting an answer. The dog licked the blanket that had wrapped the baby, and that's when someone recognized him. "That's Gracie's dog," an elderly neighbor finally said. "That's Barlow. She raised him from a pup." Laurel looked at the collar. No tags, but the name Barlow was burned into the leather. "He wasn't just watching the funeral," Laurel said. "He's been trying to protect her. Even now." Elliot sat on the nearby bench, gripping the back of his neck in disbelief. This dog waited outside the gates all night, followed the casket, and when they buried her, he knew something wasn't right. Barlow walked over to the blanket again, then lay on top of it, pressing his body against the still fabric. He didn't bark anymore. He just lay there, a silent guardian mourning not just the girl who raised him, but the truth she carried to the grave, until he forced the world to see it. Grace Turner's story was no longer one of simple loss. It had become a mystery, one with too many questions, and the only soul who had tried to uncover the truth had pause. Detective Laurel Drake stood frozen beside the open casket, the morning sunlight now casting stark, unforgiving light across the white satin interior. Beside her, Barlow remained still, his body curled protectively around the infant blanket as if daring anyone to take it away. Mourners had long since cleared the scene, many too disturbed to speak, but Laurel couldn't afford to be rattled. Not now. Something sinister had clawed its way into this burial, and it was her job to dig it out. She gently knelt and touched the baby's cloth-wrapped shoulder, feeling how cold it had become. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, not expecting an answer, except from the dog. Barlow lifted his head slightly and pressed his snout toward the blanket again, whimpering, not out of confusion, but purpose. The coroner, Dr. Hilda, stepped beside her, white gloves trembling as she examined the bundled form. Preterm, she murmured. No obvious trauma, possibly born, stillborn, or suffocated shortly after birth. Laurel narrowed her eyes. And they buried the baby without telling anyone, without reporting it? Dr. Hilda shook her head. There's no way the funeral home would have missed a second body in the casket. Someone must have placed the baby inside between the viewing and the burial. Laurel's breath caught. So whoever did this came to the funeral. They were here. They stood with us. Barlow let out a soft growl, eyes fixed on the row of trees near the fence. Laurel followed his gaze, then slowly rose, motioning to Officer Maya Knox. Start interviewing the family again. I want everyone re-logged, especially those who left early. Grace Turner's mother, Elaine, was still on the bench nearby, her expression hollow, makeup smeared down her cheeks. Her husband, Martin, paced nearby, muttering prayers under his breath. Laurel had seen grief before, but this was layered with something else. She approached them gently. Mrs. Turner, she said, did Grace ever mention she wasn't feeling well before she died? Anything unusual? Elaine blinked at her, almost as if waking up. She was, quiet lately. Spent most of her time in her room. Said she was tired from school. That's all. She gained weight, didn't she? Laurel pressed, watching her reaction closely. Elaine looked away. Teenage girls fluctuate all the time. Martin suddenly snapped. What are you implying? That we didn't know our daughter was pregnant? That we let her suffer alone? Laurel's voice remained calm, but firm. I'm saying your daughter was pregnant, and nobody, not you, not the funeral home, not the paramedics, knew. That child was hidden, Mr. Turner, and the only reason we know now is because her dog couldn't live with the lie. Martin's face turned red, and for a second, Laurel thought he might hit her, but he only clenched his fists and turned away. Back. At the gravesite, Officer Knox called her over. Ma'am, we found something. Laurel followed her to a trash bin just outside the perimeter of the cemetery fence. Inside was a discarded baby bottle, not old or dirty, but new, still smelled, faintly of formula. She lifted it with gloved fingers and nodded grimly. This wasn't here yesterday, which meant someone had tried to care for the baby, even after the burial. Back at the station, Laurel had Barlow examined by a vet. Embedded beneath his collar was a tiny GPS chip. Grace had registered him years ago. His data trail placed him near an abandoned shed 2 miles outside town in the past week, a place no one had searched. That same evening, Laurel drove out to the shed with 2 officers and a flashlight in hand. The place was barren, old hay, rusted tools, broken crates. But tucked beneath the corner of a collapsed wooden table was a makeshift bedding area, torn blankets, a stained towel, an empty baby pacifier, and a note. It was barely legible, scrawled on the back of an old receipt. I'm sorry. I didn't know what else to do. Please don't hate me. Please don't hurt my baby. Laurel stared at it, heart aching. So Grace had known. She had hidden the pregnancy, possibly gone into labor alone, maybe even tried to save the child. But something had gone wrong, and someone had helped her. Cover it up, or made the decision for her. Back at home, Barlow sat silently beside Grace's empty bed, his eyes fixed on the closet door. Laurel noticed the torn carpet near the floorboards. She opened the door slowly, and behind a false panel, found a locked journal. She pried it open with care. Inside, in Grace's delicate handwriting, were months of entries, lines full of fear, longing, and shame. She had written about a boy she loved, a boy who vanished, about sickness, hiding her growing belly, wanting to protect her family from shame, but most tragically, about how she wished someone, anyone, would have noticed. The final page was dated 2 days before her death. It read simply, Barlow is the only one who knows. He never left my side. Laurel closed the book and placed it gently on the desk. The weight of truth sat heavy on her chest. Barlow was curled on the floor, watching her. You kept her secret, she whispered, and then you made sure we'd never forget. And for the first time since the funeral, the dog's eyes softened, and his tail thumped quietly against the floor. Detective Laurel Drake stood frozen beside the open casket, the morning sunlight, now casting stark, unforgiving light across the white satin interior. Beside her, Barlow remained still, his body curled protectively around the infant blanket, as if daring anyone to take it away. Mourners had long since cleared the scene, many too disturbed to speak, but Laurel couldn't afford to be rattled. Not now. Something sinister had clawed its way into this burial, and it was her job to dig it out. She gently knelt and touched the baby's cloth-wrapped shoulder, feeling how cold it had become. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, not expecting an answer, except from the dog. Barlow lifted his head slightly and pressed his snout toward the blanket again, whimpering, not out of confusion, but purpose. The coroner, Dr. Hilda, stepped beside her, white gloves trembling as she examined the bundled form. "Preterm," she murmured. "No obvious trauma. Possibly born stillborn, or suffocated shortly after birth." Laurel narrowed her eyes. "And they buried the baby without telling anyone, without reporting it?" Dr. Hilda shook her head. "There's no way the funeral home would have missed a second body in the casket. Someone must have placed the baby inside between the viewing and the burial." Laurel's breath caught. "So whoever did this came to the funeral. They were here. They stood with us." Barlow let out a soft growl, eyes fixed on the row of trees near the fence. Laurel followed his gaze, then slowly rose, motioning to Officer Maya Knox. "Start interviewing the family again. I want everyone relogged, especially those who left early." Grace Turner's mother, Elaine, was still on the bench nearby, her expression hollow, makeup smeared down her cheeks. Her husband, Martin, paced nearby, muttering prayers under his breath. Laurel had seen grief before, but this was layered with something else. She approached them gently. "Mrs. Turner," she said, "did Grace ever mention she wasn't feeling well before she died? Anything unusual?" Elaine blinked at her, almost as if waking up. "She was quiet lately. Spent most of her time in her room. Said she was tired from school. That's all. She gained weight, didn't she?" Laurel pressed, watching her reaction closely. Elaine looked away. "Teenage girls fluctuate all the time," Martin suddenly snapped. "What are you implying? That we didn't know our daughter was pregnant? That we let her suffer alone?" Laurel's voice remained calm but firm. "I'm saying your daughter was pregnant, and nobody, not you, not the funeral home, not the paramedics, knew. That child was hidden, Mr. Turner, and the only reason we know now is because her dog couldn't live with the lie." Martin's face turned red, and for a second, Laurel thought he might hit her, but he only clenched his fists and turned away. Back at the gravesite, Officer Knox called her over. "Ma'am, we found something." Laurel followed her to a trash bin just outside the perimeter of the cemetery fence. Inside was a discarded baby bottle, not old or dirty, but new. Still smelled faintly of formula. She lifted it with gloved fingers and nodded grimly. This wasn't here yesterday, which meant someone had tried to care for the baby, even after the burial. Back at the station, Laurel had Barlow examined by a vet. Embedded beneath his collar was a tiny GPS chip. Grace had registered him years ago. His data trail placed him near an abandoned shed 2 miles outside town in the past week, a place no one had searched. That same evening, Laurel drove out to the shed with 2 officers and a flashlight in hand. The place was barren, old hay, rusted tools, broken crates. But tucked beneath the corner of a collapsed wooden table was a makeshift bedding area, torn blankets, a stained towel, an empty baby pacifier, and a note. It was barely legible, scrawled on the back of an old receipt. "I'm sorry, I didn't know what else to do. Please don't hate me. Please don't hurt my baby." Laurel stared at it, heart aching. So Grace had known. She had hidden the pregnancy, possibly gone into labor alone, maybe even tried to save the child. But something had gone wrong, and someone had helped her cover it up, or made the decision for her. Back at home, Barlow sat silently beside Grace's empty bed, his eyes fixed on the closet door. Laurel noticed the torn carpet near the floorboards. She opened the door slowly, and behind a false panel, found a locked journal. She pried it open with care. Inside, in Grace's delicate handwriting, were months of entries, lines full of fear, longing, and shame. She had written about a boy she loved, a boy who vanished, about sickness, hiding her growing belly, wanting to protect her family from shame. But most tragically, about how she wished someone, anyone, would have noticed. The final page was dated 2 days before her death. It read simply, "Barlow is the only one who knows. He never left my side." Laurel closed the book and placed it gently on the desk. The weight of truth sat heavy on her chest. Barlow was curled on the floor, watching her. "You kept her secret," she whispered, "and then you made sure we'd never forget." And for the first time since the funeral, the dog's eyes softened, and his tail thumped quietly against the floor. The journal changed everything. Laurel spent the entire night poring over Grace's handwriting, each page whispering truths no one else had dared acknowledge. There were no accusations, No finger-pointing, just pain. Quiet, buried pain. Grace had felt alone, even in a house full of people, even with friends and teachers around. She had named the baby Eli, a name she never got to say out loud. The entries hinted at complications during labor, a frantic night when she passed out, and a chilling sense of someone else being there afterward, someone who had made a choice for her and taken the baby away. By morning, Laurel had circled one paragraph again and again. I saw the blood and thought I was dying, but then I heard him cry. I remember reaching for Eli, and then it all went black. She wasn't alone that night, and that meant whoever was with her made the decision to hide the child, assuming he hadn't survived. But he had, and Barlow had known. Laurel returned to the Turner house that afternoon. The family hadn't answered her calls, and she wasn't surprised. Grief and shame tend to close doors quickly, but Martin answered with a face that looked like he hadn't slept in days. His voice was low. "If you're here to arrest us, do it. I'm tired of pretending I understand any of this." "I'm not here to arrest you," Laurel replied calmly, "but I need to speak to Elaine again. Alone." He hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside. Elaine sat curled on the sofa, eyes red, clinging to a small throw pillow as if it were a lifeline. Laurel sat across from her and placed Grace's journal on the table. "I read everything," she said softly. "Your daughter was stronger than anyone gave her credit for." Elaine stared at the journal as if it were a ghost. "I didn't. No, I swear I didn't." She got quieter, but I thought it was just school stress. "I never imagined," Laurel interrupted gently. "Grace didn't hide it because she hated you. She did it because she loved you. She was afraid of disappointing you." Elaine began to cry again, silently. Laurel leaned in. "I think someone helped her the night she gave birth. Someone tried to clean things up afterward. Someone who panicked and didn't tell anyone." Elaine looked up slowly, her eyes rimmed with understanding and fear. "My sister," she whispered. "Harper." Laurel straightened. "Harper? She was visiting that week. Grace was closer to her than she was to me. Always had been. I didn't think much of it when they spent time together. Harper said they were just painting in the shed, catching up." Laurel stood. "I need her address." Within hours, Laurel was on the road toward the outskirts of town, where Harper lived in a modest brick home near the river bend. When Harper answered, she looked calm, composed, but something about her eyes gave her away, like someone holding in a scream. "I wondered when you'd come," Harper said, stepping aside to let Laurel in. "You were with Grace the night she gave birth," Laurel said. It wasn't a question. Harper's composure cracked. "She called me, scared out of her mind. I came as fast as I could, but by the time I got there, she was already bleeding badly. I thought she was dying. I held her hand, tried to help her. Stay awake." She kept whispering the baby's name. "Eli." Laurel waited, the silence pressing. I didn't know what to do. I wrapped him in a towel. He was so still, I thought he was gone. Grace passed out, and I panicked. I thought, if anyone knew, it would destroy everything. The funeral was in 2 days. I thought I could bury the shame with her and nobody would ever know. But he was alive, Laurel said quietly. Harper's lip trembled. "I know that now. But then, I couldn't even think. I just did what I thought I had to. I laid him next to her in the coffin when no one was looking." Laurel's voice trembled now. But Barlow didn't let it go. He dug him out. Harper covered her mouth, horrified. "He saved him," Laurel nodded. "And now that baby is at County Hospital, stable, alive, and DNA will confirm everything soon." Harper collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone, I swear." Laurel stared out the window for a long moment. "Grace trusted you. She deserved more than a silent goodbye. So did Eli." Back at the station, Laurel finalized the report. The DA would decide on charges, but more than that, Laurel hoped for something deeper, closure, not just for the Turners, not just for Grace, but for that baby boy who'd been pulled out of death by nothing but the love of a dog. Later that week, Laurel returned to the cemetery. This time, she wasn't alone. Martin, Elaine, and Harper stood with her as they placed a new headstone next to Grace's. It read simply, "Eli Turner, born of silence, saved by loyalty." Barlow sat beside the stone, tail gently sweeping the grass, and somewhere above, if Grace could see, she'd know her secret hadn't buried her. It had brought them all back to life. It was raining when Laurel returned to the hospital, the kind of cold, steady drizzle that seeped into your bones and made the world feel quiet and heavy. The baby, Eli, had been moved to a private observation. room, his vitals stable, but the nurses still whispered around him like he was made of glass. Laurel stood at the glass panel, watching as he shifted in his sleep. There was a peacefulness to him that made everything feel impossibly fragile. Inside, Barlow lay curled under the crib. He hadn't left the baby's side once. Not when the machines beeped. Not when the doctors examined him. Not even when food was offered. His loyalty had become a fixture in the room, an unspoken promise etched in every motion. The doctors had tried to move him once, and the dog had growled, low and defensive, until they backed off. Laurel finally stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The dog looked up, his golden eyes tired but alert. She knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his back. "You knew," she whispered, "before any of us. You knew he was still alive." Barlow nudged her hand with his nose, then returned his gaze to the crib. He wasn't looking for thanks. He wasn't waiting for recognition. He was guarding something sacred. Just then, a quiet knock sounded on the door, and Nurse Camille stepped in, holding an envelope. "The DNA results just came in," she said, softly, handing it over. Laurel held it for a moment without opening it. She didn't need the paperwork to confirm what she already felt in her gut, but facts mattered, especially for what she had to do next. She peeled the seal open and scanned the page. Her breath caught. A perfect match. The baby was Grace Turner's son. The silence in the room grew heavier. Laurel's mind turned to Elaine and Martin, parents who had buried a daughter and now had to face the truth that she had died not only misunderstood, but trying to protect a child no one believed existed. She drove to the Turner house that evening. The lights inside were dim, shadows pooling in corners like grief made visible. Elaine answered the door, her face pale and lined with exhaustion. "You should come in," she said quietly. Laurel entered the living room where Martin sat with a glass of untouched whiskey, and Harper stared at the fire like it might consume her next. The tension in the room was thick. No one spoke until Laurel took a seat and laid the DNA papers on the table. "It's confirmed," she said. "The child is Grace's. His name, if you didn't know, is Eli." Elaine pressed her hand over her mouth. Martin's eyes filled with something between disbelief and awe. Harper looked away. "Where is he now?" Elaine finally asked. "County. General, he's safe, recovering. The doctors think he'll grow up without any complications." "And the dog?" Martin asked, his voice cracking. Laurel almost smiled. "Still won't leave his side." For a long time, no one moved. Then Harper spoke. "Do you hate me?" Elaine turned slowly toward her sister, eyes brimming with tears. "I don't even know what to feel. I just wish Grace had come to me instead of hiding in the shed, hiding her pain, hiding everything. She didn't want to shame you," Harper murmured. "She thought she'd ruin your name, the family." "No," Elaine said, standing now, voice trembling. "She needed a mother, and I wasn't one." Laurel stood as well, giving them space. "You'll have decisions to make. Eli is in state custody for now, but given the circumstances, with the right petition, you could bring him home, if that's what you want." Elaine nodded. "It's what Grace would have wanted." As she was leaving, Laurel hesitated at the door. "There's one more thing." She pulled out a small video file on her phone and handed it to Martin. "Hospital security footage. Thought you'd want to see it." They all gathered around the screen. The footage was silent, grainy. It showed Barlow, muddy and wild-eyed, pushing open the ER doors with the baby wrapped in a blanket, clenched gently in his jaws. The dog approached the nurse's desk and laid the bundle down, then nudged it with his snout until someone noticed. Then he sat beside the child, not moving. Harper sobbed. Elaine covered her mouth again. Martin whispered, "He brought him back." Laurel left them with that image burned in their minds, not of shame, not of grief, but of love. Later that night, as she walked down the quiet hospital hallway, she stopped at Eli's room. Through the window she could see the baby stirring in his crib, and Barlow, still there, lifted his head slowly, then looked toward the door. Their eyes met. This story wasn't just about tragedy, it was about what rose from it. A baby saved by a sister's regret, a mother facing truth, a dog who had dug through death to protect something still alive, and somewhere in the silence, the world had shifted, because one girl named Grace had loved her baby too much to let him go, even if it took a dog to make the rest of them see. The funeral was held again, this time not just to mourn Grace, but to honor her. The second ceremony took place in the same churchyard, but the energy had changed. There were no murmurs of shame, no sidelong glances or hushed judgment. This time the town showed up with something else in their eyes. Guilt, maybe, or a quiet respect they hadn't earned the first time. Laurel stood near the front, not as an officer now, but as a witness to the truth. Beside her sat Elaine and Martin, with baby Eli resting in Elaine's arms. He was bundled tightly, cheeks rosy, eyes blinking at the filtered sunlight slipping through the trees. Grace's name was etched into the new headstone, alongside a line chosen by Elaine herself. She loved beyond fear, and that love saved a life. Barlow sat at the foot of the grave. He hadn't moved when the crowd arrived, hadn't even barked. He simply lay still, head on his paws, watching as if he understood the moment carried something sacred. The townspeople kept their distance. From him now, not out of fear, but reverence. Word of what he had done had spread far beyond Brookhaven. Even the state governor sent a letter of commendation. But the dog didn't care for medals or headlines. He only cared that the baby was safe. After the final prayer, Elaine stood up with Eli in her arms. Her hands shook slightly, but her voice did not. My daughter Grace was not a disgrace. She was not a mistake. She was a mother, a scared, hurting, brave young woman who was failed by the people who should have stood by her. And yet, she chose to give this child life, and she died, protecting him. She turned toward Barlow. And this dog, he understood what none of us did. He saw worth where we saw scandal. He carried my grandson through fire and grief, through frost and hunger, just to bring him somewhere safe. I owe him more than I can ever say. Martin stepped beside her and gently placed a hand on her back. We all do. The ceremony ended, and people began to drift away, murmuring soft apologies, condolences, promises to do better. Harper approached the grave last. She placed a single white flower on the soil, then knelt beside the headstone. "I'm sorry, Grace," she whispered. "I said things I didn't mean. I judged you because I didn't know how to be brave. But I'll make it right. I'll help raise him. I'll help tell your story. I swear it." Barlow stood up as if sensing the weight of her words, then nudged her shoulder gently. She looked at him, tears sliding down her cheeks. "You forgave her before any of us did. Didn't you?" Back at the hospital, Laurel finalized the paperwork to release Eli into Elaine and Martin's custody. The state had fast-tracked the process after the story went public, and though the Turners had once pushed their daughter away, they now vowed never to let shame silence their love again. Laurel stayed behind for a moment after everyone left. She stood in Eli's now empty hospital room and let her fingers rest on the crib's edge. It felt strange how full and quiet the room was without the baby's soft breathing and the low protective hum of the dog beside him. The door creaked open, and Dr. Elias Grant stepped in. He looked exhausted, but there was warmth in his smile. "You did something good here," he said. "All of you." Laurel nodded. "It wasn't me. It was her. It was him." She gestured to the photo now taped beside the crib. Grace holding the baby in her lap, Barlow resting his head beside them both. It had been taken the day before Grace died, found on her old phone buried in a box in the shed. "She didn't run away to hide her shame," Laurel said quietly. "She hid because she thought it was the only way to protect him." Dr. Grant sighed. And in the end it was. As Laurel turned to leave, she spotted Barlow waiting at the exit of the pediatric wing. A nurse held his leash gently, though they both knew he didn't need it. Laurel crouched down, meeting his gaze. "You ready to go home?" she asked. Barlow tilted his head slightly, then walked beside her as they exited. But instead of heading to her car, she paused. "What if," she murmured, "you weren't meant to go home with me?" She looked down at him. "What if you already chose yours?" Later that evening, Laurel returned to the Turner house. The porch light was on, and laughter spilled out from inside. She knocked once. Elaine answered, surprised to see her. But before she could speak, Barlow stepped forward. Elaine's eyes softened. "He came back?" Laurel nodded. "He never left. Not really." Barlow trotted past her, straight to the crib tucked in the corner of the living room. Eli kicked his feet at the sight of him, giggling as the dog sat beside him and let the tiny hands tug at his ears. "He's yours," Laurel said. "If you'll have him." Elaine nodded through her tears. "We all ready?" "Doe." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the town of Brookhaven, something shifted. In the echo of tragedy, there was redemption. In the silence of shame, a truth had been unearthed, not by judgment or authority, but by a creature who loved without conditions, a dog who saw through the lies, a daughter who gave everything, and a baby, once hidden, now wrapped in warmth and family and forgiveness. Sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms. Sometimes they don't speak at all. They just stand guard, dig deep, and carry the broken pieces of love back into the light.